They said you can't hurt me. The Deathworld girl said, I don't miss. The first time I understood what a human could do, someone was pointing a charged weapon at my head. I am Vel Tharik, and I had been living on the trade station Corvus Reach for 6 months, cataloging the behavior of a species my government still did not fully trust. That morning I was buying tea from a market stall when a man with a scarred face and a stolen sidearm decided my translator unit was worth stealing. He grabbed my collar and pressed the weapon under my jaw, and I remember thinking, quite calmly, that this was how my report would end, unfinished, filed by someone else. Then a woman stepped out from behind a crate of dried fruit, set down the bag she was carrying and said, "You should let go of him now." She was small. She wore a plain gray jacket with a torn sleeve, and her hair was tied back in a simple knot, and nothing about her suggested danger. The man laughed at her. He should not have laughed. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. I did not see all of it, because my eyes are not built for that kind of speed, but I saw enough. Her hand moved once. The weapon was no longer in his hand. He was on the ground, not badly hurt, just suddenly and completely unable to stand, and she was already picking her bag back up like nothing at all had happened. She looked at me and asked if I was all right. I said yes, though I was not entirely certain that was true. She nodded once, said something about needing to catch a supply shuttle, and walked away. I did not know her name yet. I would learn it soon enough, and I would spend the rest of my posting on that station trying to understand what I had just seen. My people are called the Cathan. We are old, careful, and slow to anger, because anger tends to get us killed. We build our cities to last 1,000 years, and our treaties to last longer. We do not enjoy surprises, and of all the species we had made contact with in the last century, none had unsettled us quite like the humans. On paper, humans should not have been remarkable. Their technology was younger than ours by centuries. Their ships were smaller, their weapons simpler, their government still arguing with itself about how to speak with one voice to the rest of the galaxy. Every measurable statistic said humans were a young, developing species that should be cautious and deferential in the company of older civilizations. They were not cautious. They were not deferential. And the strange part was, they did not seem to be posturing either. They simply moved through dangerous situations the way the rest of us moved through a quiet afternoon, and it took me weeks of watching before I understood why. Humanity had colonized dozens of worlds since leaving their homeworld, and most of those worlds were what the wider galaxy classified, in the driest possible language, as environmentally severe. Crushing gravity, thin, biting atmospheres, predators that hunted in packs and did not care how clever your spear was, worlds where a single mistake did not mean an inconvenience. It meant your name got carved onto a wall and nothing else. The rest of the galaxy called these worlds death worlds, and avoided them the way sensible people avoid standing near a cliff edge in a storm. Humans built towns on them, then cities. Then, somehow, they still had enough humans left over to go build starships and come say hello to the rest of us. The woman who had disarmed my attacker without spilling her groceries turned out to be one of the technicians assigned to Enclave 7, the human quarter of the station. Her name was Mira Kessel. She fixed environmental systems, moved supply crates, and kept almost entirely to herself. I made it my business to meet her properly. I told myself this was research. It was also, if I am honest, curiosity that bordered on fear, the specific kind of fear you feel when you realize the quiet person across the room could probably end an argument before you finished raising your voice. Mira agreed to have tea with me 2 days later, in a small canteen near the Enclave that served food from a dozen worlds badly, and somehow made it taste like home for everyone who ate there. She was polite. She asked about my family before I could ask about hers, which surprised me. She laughed, once, at a joke I made about Cathan bureaucracy, and the laugh sounded genuinely warm, not performed. I asked her, carefully, about the man in the market. "He wasn't going to hurt you," she said. "Not really." His hands were shaking. People whose hands shake like that are scared, not dangerous. I just needed him to stop being stupid before he scared himself into doing something he couldn't undo. I asked how she knew that so quickly. She looked at me for a moment, the way you look at someone who has asked a question they don't realize is complicated. "Where I grew up," she said, "you learn to read a threat fast, or you don't get old enough to learn much else." That was the first time she mentioned Ashen's Reach. She did not explain further that day, and I did not push, because something in her voice told me the subject was heavier than her tone suggested. Word of new arrivals moves quickly on a station like Corvus Reach, and 2 days after our tea, the docking authority announced an incoming trade delegation from the Voranth Assembly. I had encountered Voranth before, at diplomatic functions where they mostly stood at the edges of rooms looking unimpressed with everyone in them. They were a proud, martial species, tall and broad, with layered plates of natural armor across their shoulders and forearms, plating that could knit itself back together after injury faster than most weapons could inflict damage. 3 centuries of contact with a dozen other species had taught the Voranth exactly one lesson, over and over, until it became doctrine. Nothing smaller than another Voranth could hurt a Voranth, and so nothing smaller than a Voranth deserved much respect. Their ship was larger than it needed to be for a simple trade visit, the kind of vessel built to be noticed. I watched it dock from the observation deck, and beside me, Commander Ellis Doran, the station's head of security, let out a long breath through his nose. "Every time the Voranth show up," he said, "somebody ends up in the medical bay proving a point nobody asked them to prove." I asked him what point that usually was. "That they can't be hurt," he said, "and so far station records agree with them." I remember looking down at the docking bay, at the ramp lowering from that oversized ship, and feeling the particular unease of someone who suspects 2 things are about to be true in the same room for the first time. A species convinced it could not be hurt, and a woman who had just shown me, without raising her voice, exactly how little that kind of confidence was worth. I did not know yet how those 2 facts would collide. I only knew, standing there, that I wanted to be far away from Corvus Reach when they did. I was wrong about that too. I would end up closer to it than anyone. The Voranth delegation was led by a warrior named Karagath, and within an hour of stepping off his ship he had already made 3 separate station officials visibly uncomfortable, which I later learned was something of a personal record even for his species. He walked the promenade with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once needed to check over his shoulder, because nothing on any station he had ever visited had given him a reason to. I watched him from a distance that first day, more out of professional habit than anything else. He stopped at a stall selling carved trinkets from a dozen worlds, picked up a small blade meant as a decorative letter opener, turned it over in his huge hand, and laughed loud enough that half the promenade turned to look. "This," he said to his companions, holding it up, "is what the smaller species call a weapon." Nobody laughed with him. A few people looked away, the way you look away from a fire that is burning slightly too close to something flammable. I made a note in my report that evening. Species, Voranth. Behavior, unprovoked demonstration of superiority. Risk to station relations, moderate, pending further incidents. I did not know yet that I would need to revise that note twice more before the week was finished, and that the second revision would use the word severe. I went back to Enclave 7 that night, mostly because I found myself wanting the particular quiet of that place, where people spoke plainly and did not perform for each other. Mira was in the common room, repairing a piece of equipment with the kind of patient focus that made the rest of the room feel slower by comparison. I sat across from her and told her about Karagath, about the blade, about the laugh that filled the promenade. She did not look up from her work right away. When she finally did, her expression was not angry. It was something quieter than that, something closer to recognition, like she had met 100 versions of that same laugh before, and none of them had ended well for the person laughing. "Some people," she said, "have never had anything actually try to kill them, so they start believing nothing ever could." I asked her what happens to people like that, eventually. She set down her tool, wiped her hands on a cloth, and looked at me with an expression I would remember for a long time afterward. "Eventually," she said, "they meet something that isn't impressed." I laughed at the time, because it sounded like a joke, the kind of thing people say to sound clever over tea. I did not laugh later, when I understood she had not been joking at all. She had been describing, with perfect accuracy, exactly what was coming. I asked Mira, a few nights later, to tell me about Ashen's Reach. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought she might refuse, and then she asked if I had ever seen real gravity before, the kind that makes your bones remember every step you take. I told her I had not. Cathan worlds are gentle places, deliberately so, because we build our homes to be comfortable rather than to survive us. Ashen's Reach pulls at you like it's trying to keep something, she said. 1.5 times what you're used to, every hour of every day, from the moment you're born until the moment you die. Children there learn to crawl later than children anywhere else, because their own bodies are heavier than they can lift, but they also grow stronger faster, because there's no other choice. She described the sky as a pale, bruised color, thin enough that you needed a breathing filter outside the settlement walls, and cold enough at night that anyone caught outside without shelter simply did not wake up in the morning. She described the wall around her settlement not as a decoration or a tradition, but as a daily, practical necessity, because beyond it lived creatures the settlers called ridgehounds, pack hunters with 6 legs, and patience that outlasted most human tempers. They don't attack right away, she said. They watch first, sometimes for days. They're testing you, figuring out when you're tired, when you're careless, when you've stopped paying attention. My grandmother used to say the ridgehounds were the best teachers we ever had, because they never once let a mistake go unpunished. I asked her what happened to children who made mistakes. She looked down at her hands before she answered. Some of them don't get to grow up, she said simply. That's just true. Nobody pretends otherwise where I'm from. You don't get a gentle version of that lesson. You get the real one, early, and you either learn it, or you become a story people tell to make sure the next child learns it instead. I did not know what to say to that. On Kython worlds, we shield our children from danger for as long as we possibly can, sometimes for decades, and we consider that shielding a mark of how civilized we have become. It had never once occurred to me that a species might grow past danger not by hiding from it, but by meeting it early, on purpose, again and again, until it stopped being able to surprise them. How old were you, I asked, when you were given your first weapon? 12, she said, and there was no pride in the answer, and no shame either. It was simply a fact, the way you might state the temperature outside. It wasn't a gift. Nobody threw a party. My father handed me a rifle the same way he'd have handed me a wrench, because the herd beasts that graze near the eastern fence sometimes wander too close to the water lines, and somebody has to be able to turn them away before they trample the pipes we all depend on. He didn't teach me to be a soldier. He taught me to be useful. The fact that being useful also meant being dangerous was just how things were. She told me about the first time she had to use it for real, not on a herd beast, but on a ridgehound that had gotten separated from its pack, and, desperate and starving, had come over the fence at dusk while she was walking home from the water station. She described it without drama, almost clinically, the way you might describe fixing a broken valve. The animal had been thin, sick, moving in a way that told her it had nothing left to lose, which her father had once told her made an animal far more dangerous than a healthy one, because it had stopped being cautious. I had one shot before it closed the distance, she said. After that, it wouldn't have mattered how good my aim was anymore, so I made the one shot count. I asked, half out of curiosity and half because I genuinely wanted to know whether she had ever missed. She thought about the question seriously, which told me she understood I wasn't asking to be polite. Missing, where I grew up, isn't like missing anywhere else, she said. It's not just failing to hit a target. It's the difference between walking home and not walking home, between your little brother having a working water line in winter or not having one. You stop thinking of it as skill after a while. It just becomes something you owe the people depending on you. So no, I try very hard not to. I wrote that conversation down word for word that night, because I understood, even then, that I was hearing something important, something that would matter later, though I did not yet know how much. The Voranth delegation, meanwhile, was making itself increasingly difficult to ignore. Karagath had taken to visiting the docking bays each morning, where cargo crews from a dozen species loaded and unloaded freight under tight schedules and tighter tempers. He seemed to enjoy watching them work, the way some people enjoy watching insects struggle in a jar, not out of any particular cruelty, but out of a total absence of curiosity about whether the insects minded. One morning, I was present when a young human dock worker named Owen Blake miscalculated the mass of a crate he was guiding into place, and it swung wide on its cable, clipping Karagath across the shoulder plating hard enough to have staggered most people. Karagath did not stagger. He simply turned, unhurried, and looked at the crate, then at Owen, with an expression of mild, almost scientific interest, as if checking whether the impact had left so much as a mark. It had not. Of course it had not. Apologize, Karagath said, not with anger, but with the bored patience of someone correcting a child. Owen apologized immediately, his voice tight, with the particular fear of someone who has just realized how much larger, and how much more armored, the person in front of him is. Karagath studied him a moment longer, then reached out and flicked the crate itself, hard enough to send it swinging on its cable again, forcing Owen to scramble to steady it. Careful, Karagath said. Some of us bruise easier than others. He walked away laughing, and his companions laughed with him, and Owen stood there gripping the cable with both hands, shaking slightly, and nobody on the dock crew said a word until the Voranth were well out of earshot. I reported the incident to Commander Doran that afternoon, and he rubbed his eyes in the particular way of someone who has seen this pattern before and knows exactly where it leads. They do this every time, he said, testing how far they can push before somebody pushes back. Problem is, most species learn fast that pushing back against a Voranth doesn't end well for the one doing the pushing, so they stop testing, and the Voranth mistake that for respect. I asked him what happened on the rare occasions when someone did not stop. He did not answer right away. He looked out the viewport toward the docking bays, where Karagath's oversized ship sat gleaming under the station lights, and he said, quietly, "Then it usually ends up being a very long day for everybody involved." I thought about Mira's rifle, and her one shot, and the water lines her family depended on, and I found myself hoping, with an intensity that surprised me, that this particular long day would not arrive while I was still assigned to this station. It arrived 4 days later, and I was there for all of it. But before that morning came, there was one more evening I remember clearly, because it was the last quiet one. Mira and I sat again in the common room of Enclave 7, and she was mending the torn sleeve of the same gray jacket she had worn the day we met, sewing with small, careful stitches, the kind of patience that seemed to run through everything she did. I told her about Owen, about the crate, about the way Karagath had smiled while he did it. She listened without interrupting, her needle moving steadily the whole time, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "People like that," she said, "always think the ones who stay calm around them are weak. They've never had to learn the difference between calm and careful." I asked her which one she was. She tied off the thread, bit it neatly, and held the jacket up to check her work before answering. "Both," she said. "At the same time. That's usually how it works where I'm from." I did not understand, fully, what she meant by that, until I watched her stand in front of Karagath 4 days later and accept a challenge that every rational instinct I possessed told me she could not possibly survive. I was wrong about that too. By then, I was beginning to notice a pattern in how often I was wrong about her. The morning it happened, I was on the promenade for an entirely unrelated reason, delivering a report to the station administrator's office, and so I saw the whole thing unfold from the very first moment, rather than hearing about it secondhand the way I had heard about the crate. Owen Blake was setting up a display of salvaged parts near the dock entrance, part of a small side trade he ran to earn extra credits beyond his shift work, arranging pieces of old equipment on a folding table, with the careful pride of someone who had built something out of very little. Karagath and 2 of his companions came down the promenade at their usual unhurried pace, and I saw the exact moment Karagath noticed the table, and I felt, before anything happened, a cold certainty about what was coming. He picked up a small mechanical part, examined it, and set it back down slightly crooked, watching Owen's face as he did it. Owen straightened it without comment. Karagath picked it up again, turned it over, and this time let it fall, not hard, but deliberately, so that it clattered off the table and rolled toward the floor grating. "Careless of me," Karagath said, in a tone that made clear it had not been careless at all. Owen bent to retrieve it without a word. I understood, watching him, that he was doing exactly what he had been taught to do around someone visibly stronger and armored beyond anything he could match, which was to make himself as small and unremarkable as possible, and wait for the moment to pass. It did not pass. Karagath reached out and, with one finger, tipped the entire table sideways, sending every carefully arranged part crashing to the floor. A crowd had begun to gather by then, the particular crowd that forms on stations like Corvus Reach whenever tension becomes visible. People who slow their walking without quite stopping, who watch without quite watching. I stood among them, my recorder running, my hands unsteady in a way I was not proud of. Owen knelt and began gathering his scattered parts, and Karagath crouched down across from him, at eye level, close enough that his shadow fell entirely over the smaller man. "You should thank me," Karagath said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear clearly. "I am teaching you something useful. Your species keeps forgetting where it stands. Perhaps if I remind you enough times, it will finally take hold." Owen said nothing. His hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the particular strain of controlled anger with nowhere safe to go. Karagath stood, addressing the crowd now rather than Owen alone, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who has never once doubted the outcome of a confrontation. 3 centuries, he said, since my people first met yours. And in 3 centuries, not one of you has managed so much as a scratch on Voranth plating. You send children with sticks to face warriors, and you call this diplomacy. You call this equal standing. He laughed, and gestured at Owen still kneeling on the floor. You can't hurt me. None of you can. Not with your little weapons, not with your soft hands. There is nothing in this station, nothing your whole species has ever built, that could leave a mark on me. The words hung in the recycled air of the promenade, and nobody moved to answer them, because everyone present understood, correctly, that Karagath was not exaggerating. Station medical logs, station security records, 3 centuries of documented contact, all of it agreed with him completely. I remember thinking, in that moment, that the silence itself was a kind of surrender, the sound of an entire crowd quietly accepting a claim none of them could dispute. Then I heard footsteps, unhurried, coming from the direction of Enclave 7, and the crowd shifted slightly to let someone through. And I saw Mira Kessel walk to the front of the gathering with the same calm, unremarkable bearing she had carried the day she disarmed the man threatening me in the market. She looked down at Owen, still kneeling among his scattered parts, and reached out a hand to help him up. He took it, and she pulled him to his feet, and only then did she turn to face Karagath directly. "That's not true," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The promenade had gone quiet enough that every word carried. Karagath looked down at her the way you might look at a small animal that had wandered somewhere it did not belong, mildly curious, entirely unthreatened. "And what would you know about it?" he said. "I know you've never actually been tested," she said. "Everyone who's ever faced you either wasn't trying to hurt you or wasn't equipped to. That's not the same thing as being unable to be hurt. It just means nobody's found the right way yet." A ripple went through the crowd, the particular sound of many people inhaling at once. Karagath's companions shifted, and I saw Commander Doran push through the gathering from the opposite side, his expression already tight with the specific dread of someone who has arrived exactly one sentence too late to prevent something. Karagath studied Mira for a long moment, and something in his posture changed, the easy contempt sharpening into genuine attention, the way a predator's gaze sharpens when something small refuses to run. "You are offering to be the one who finds it," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm offering to end this," Mira said, gesturing at Owen, at the scattered parts, at the crowd itself. "You made your point. Now you're just enjoying yourself. There's a difference, and everyone here can see it." Commander Doran arrived at that moment, breathless, and put a hand toward Mira's shoulder, though he stopped short of actually touching her. "Mira," he said, low and urgent, "you do not want to do this." "I don't want him doing this either," she said, without looking away from Karagath. "Somebody has to say something. It might as well be me." Karagath's second, a broad Voranth warrior I would later learn was named Baransk, stepped forward and spoke to Karagath in their own language, low and rapid, clearly urging caution, or perhaps simply confirming procedure. Karagath waved him off without looking away from Mira. "Voranth custom recognizes a trial of honor," Karagath said, addressing the crowd again now, his confidence fully restored, perhaps even amused. "A challenge issued and accepted, witnessed properly, settled according to tradition. It is a courtesy we rarely extend to smaller species, because it is rarely requested, and even more rarely deserved. But if this human wishes to test her claim against mine, I will not refuse her the honor." Commander Doran's voice was tight with barely controlled alarm. "The trial of honor is a duel," he said quietly, to me, though I already understood the shape of what was happening. "Full contact. Voranth rules. Voranth weapons permitted alongside whatever the challenger brings, and no interference once it begins, by station law or assembly treaty, whichever comes first. Nobody's ever survived one who wasn't Voranth themselves." I asked him why the ritual even permitted outsiders to participate at all, if the outcome was so thoroughly assumed. "Because it costs the Voranth nothing to be generous when they've never lost," he said. "It looks like fairness. It isn't." Karagath named the terms aloud, for the benefit of the crowd and the station's official record. The trial would take place in the station's largest cargo bay, cleared and prepared, in 2 days' time, witnessed by representatives of both parties, and by neutral station authority. Any weapon each combatant could personally carry and operate would be permitted. No station security intervention once the trial formally began. The contest would end when one combatant could no longer continue, by their own concession or by the judgment of the witnesses. 2 days, Karagath said. To prepare and to reconsider, should wisdom arrive late. He smiled, an expression that showed too many teeth to be friendly. "I would not think less of you for reconsidering." "I won't need 2 days, Mira said, "but I'll take them anyway." "Owen still needs help picking up his table." She turned without waiting for Karagath's response, and knelt to help gather the last of the scattered parts, setting them back onto the folding table with the same careful patience I had watched her use mending her jacket sleeve. The crowd began to disperse slowly around her, murmuring, and Karagath watched her for a long moment before finally turning and walking away with his companions, his laughter trailing behind him down the promenade. I stayed and helped gather parts as well, mostly because I did not know what else to do with my hands. Owen thanked Mira quietly, his voice still unsteady, and asked her, in a low voice clearly not meant for the departing crowd, whether she actually believed she could win. "I believe I can hurt him," she said. "Whether that's the same as winning depends on what happens after." That answer did not comfort me at all, and I told her so as we walked back toward Enclave 7 together. "It's not supposed to comfort you," she said. "It's supposed to be honest." Over the following 2 days, I watched Mira prepare in a way that looked almost nothing like what I expected preparation for mortal combat to resemble. She did not train aggressively, did not spend hours in a gymnasium building strength she plainly already possessed enough of. Instead, she spent long hours studying recordings, station medical scans that Commander Doran quietly and somewhat illegally provided her, footage of Voranth physiology from decades of prior diplomatic and medical exchanges, anatomical charts from the few Voranth doctors who had ever agreed to share them with outside researchers. She sat with these materials the way she had once sat mending her jacket, patient, unhurried, entirely absorbed. I asked her, on the second evening, what exactly she was looking for. "Everyone assumes armor means there's no gap," she said, not looking up from the scan in front of her. "But armor has to move, joints have to bend, eyes have to see. Anything that has to move or see or breathe has a place where the plating can't cover it completely, because if it did, the whole body would be a statue instead of a warrior. I'm not looking for a weakness because I think one exists in theory. I'm looking for the specific one that exists in fact, on this exact species, in this exact posture, because that's the only kind of weakness that's actually useful to me." She found what she was looking for a few hours before the trial was scheduled to begin, and she said very little about it afterward, only that it was small and narrow, and would require her to wait until Karagath, in his complete confidence, offered it to her without realizing what he had done. Commander Doran came to see her the night before, and I was present for the conversation, standing quietly near the door of her small quarters while he made one final attempt to talk her out of what was coming. "I can invoke a station safety hold," he said. "Delay it, buy time to petition the Assembly directly, argue the terms were extracted under duress, something, anything. I don't want to be standing in that cargo bay tomorrow reading your name into a casualty report." Mira looked up from the small pack she was preparing, weapons and equipment laid out with the same careful order she brought to everything. "If you delay it," she said, "he'll just do the same thing to someone else next week. Someone who doesn't have the choice I have. I grew up somewhere that taught me exactly how to face something bigger and faster and better armored than I am, because that was every single day of my childhood. Owen didn't get that childhood. Most people on this station didn't. I did. That's not luck, Commander. That's the only reason I'm the right person to be doing this instead of him." Commander Doran had no answer for that, and after a long moment he simply nodded, wished her well in a voice that did not sound at all confident it would help, and left. I stayed a while longer, watching her finish preparing her equipment in silence. "Are you afraid?" I finally asked, because it seemed, after everything, like the only honest question left to ask. She considered it seriously, the way she considered every question I had ever put to her. "Yes," she said, "but fear where I'm from isn't something you wait to go away before you act. It's just something you carry with you while you do what needs doing. It never gets to make the decision for you, it just gets to come along." I left her quarters that night with the uncomfortable, growing certainty that I was about to witness something the rest of the galaxy would be discussing for a very long time afterward, whichever way it ended. The cargo bay had been cleared to a wide open circle, its usual crates and loaders pushed back against the walls, and by the time I arrived, the space was already crowded with witnesses from a dozen species, drawn by word that had spread across the entire station in less than 2 days. Voranth custom required a formal audience, and word had clearly reached beyond Corvus Reach itself, because I recognized several faces from neighboring diplomatic postings, arrived just to see whether the old certainty would hold one more time. Karagath entered first, to the low, rhythmic sound of his companions striking their forearms against their chest plating. A Voranth gesture of respect I had seen only twice before, both times reserved for warriors of genuine reputation. He wore ceremonial plating over his already formidable natural armor, polished until it caught the bay's overhead lights, and he moved into the circle with the unhurried confidence of a man who considered the outcome already decided, and the ceremony merely a formality owed to tradition. Mira entered a few minutes later, alone, wearing the same plain gray jacket, the torn sleeve now neatly mended. She carried a single rifle, the kind used for practical work rather than display, and a small sidearm at her hip, and nothing else. No armor. No ceremonial plating. She looked, standing across the circle from Karagath, exactly as unremarkable as she had looked the day I first met her, and I understood, watching the crowd's reaction, that this contrast was doing exactly what Karagath wanted it to do, making his eventual, assumed victory look even larger by comparison. Commander Doran read the terms aloud for the official record, his voice carrying clearly across the bay despite its evident strain. The trial would begin on his signal. It would end when one combatant conceded, or when the witnesses judged one combatant incapable of continuing. No station personnel would intervene once the trial began. By treaty obligation, neither side could waive. Karagath addressed the crowd once more before the signal, unable, it seemed, to resist a final word. "I have fought representatives of 11 species in my lifetime," he said. "None left a mark on me that lasted longer than the fight itself. I take no pleasure in what is about to happen. I take only the certainty of it." He looked at Mira directly. "Concede now, and I will consider the matter of this station's dignity already settled." "I'll pass," Mira said. "But thank you for the offer." Commander Doran gave the signal. Karagath moved first, and he moved fast, far faster than his size suggested he should be able to, closing half the circle's distance in a single stride, testing her, I understood later, the way a much larger animal tests a smaller one, not with full commitment but with a probing strike meant to gauge her reaction time. Mira did not retreat and did not engage. She simply stepped aside, a small, economical movement, and let the strike pass through empty air where she had been standing a half-second earlier. Karagath laughed, low and genuinely pleased. "Quick," he said. "Quicker than most." "It will not matter." He pressed again, and again she moved rather than met him directly, circling rather than retreating, watching him the way I had seen her watch a piece of broken equipment before deciding how to fix it, with total, unhurried attention. Several times he came close enough that the crowd gasped, certain the contest was about to end, and each time she was simply no longer where his strike landed, a half-step removed, conserving something I did not yet understand she needed to conserve. I realized, watching this unfold, that she was not fighting Karagath at all, not in the way the crowd expected a fight to look. She was studying him in motion, confirming in real combat conditions what she had only studied on scans and recordings 2 nights earlier, watching exactly how his plating shifted when he raised his arm to strike, exactly how far his neck extended when he leaned forward to close distance, exactly which small, narrow places on his body opened for a fraction of a second, and then closed again as he moved. Karagath, for his part, seemed to interpret her caution as simple fear, and his confidence grew with every strike that failed to land, rather than diminishing the way a more careful fighter's might have. He began to take larger risks, extending further, committing more fully to each strike, certain that eventual contact was only a matter of time and patience, certain that nothing she carried could hurt him even if contact came. "You are fast," he said, circling now himself, no longer entirely amused. "But speed only delays what cannot be prevented. Strike me, if you can. I invite it. Show this crowd exactly how little it will matter." He lunged again, fully committed this time, both arms extended to close the distance completely, and in doing so, his head tilted forward and down at precisely the angle Mira had spent 2 nights studying on decades of Voranth medical scans, exposing, for less than a full second, the narrow, unarmored gap at the base of his skull, where the plating had to yield space for the movement of his neck, a gap so small and so brief that no weapon requiring more than an instant of aim could ever have found it. Mira did not hesitate, and she did not waste the opportunity gathering herself for a larger, more dramatic strike. She raised the rifle in a single fluid motion, the same economical motion I had watched her use to mend a torn sleeve and disarm a frightened man in a market, and fired once. The sound in the enclosed cargo bay was smaller than I expected, almost anticlimactic, a single sharp report swallowed quickly by the wide space around it. Karagath's forward momentum carried him half a step further before his body registered what had happened, and then he stopped, entirely, his massive frame going rigid in a way that no strike against his plating had ever managed to produce. The crowd went utterly silent. Baransk, his second, took a half step forward and then stopped himself, hands raised, uncertain what the terms of intervention now permitted, uncertain, I think, whether he was watching something that could even be real. Karagath did not fall immediately. He stood for a long moment, swaying slightly, one hand rising slowly toward the back of his own neck, touching the place where the plating had failed to protect him, as if confirming with his own fingers something his mind had not yet fully accepted. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the easy contempt it carried moments before. "That is not possible," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It is now," Mira said. He went down to one knee then, not defeated in the way the crowd might have expected from a larger confrontation, but plainly, undeniably wounded, in a way his body had genuinely never experienced before, and did not know how to process. His companions moved forward now, past whatever hesitation the treaty terms had imposed, and Commander Doran called the trial's end, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned quiet of the bay. Mira lowered the rifle and did not move toward Karagath, did not gloat, did not raise the weapon again or offer any further gesture at all. She simply stood where she was, watching, the same patient, unhurried attention she had carried through the entire trial, as though she were simply confirming that a repair had held rather than celebrating a victory. Karagath, kneeling now, his companions gathered anxiously around him, looked up at her with an expression I had genuinely never seen on a Voranth face before, something that was not quite fear and not quite disbelief, but sat uncomfortably close to both. "You said," he managed, his voice rough, "that you could hurt me. You did not say you would not miss." Mira looked at him for a long moment before she answered, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, without triumph, without cruelty, carrying only the same plain, unshakable certainty I had heard the first evening she told me about her rifle, and her father, and the water lines her whole settlement depended on. "I don't miss," she said. "I never have. Not once, when it mattered. That was never the part you needed to worry about." She turned then, and walked out of the circle, and the crowd parted to let her pass in a silence that felt less like fear now, and more like the particular, disoriented quiet of people who have just watched a fact they believed unshakable prove, without any warning at all, to be nothing more than an assumption nobody had ever properly tested. I stood in that cargo bay for a long time after she left, watching Karagath's companions help him slowly to his feet, watching the crowd disperse in small, murmuring clusters, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that whatever the galaxy had believed about humanity up until that morning was already, quietly and permanently, no longer true. Karagath survived. I want to say that clearly, because in the days that followed, rumors spread across the station and beyond it, faster than any official report could correct them, and some of those rumors claimed otherwise. Station Medical treated him within the hour, and the same regeneration that had made him famous across 3 centuries of contact healed the wound itself within a matter of days. What did not heal, and what I suspect never fully would, was the simple, unshakable fact that had defined his entire species' place in the galaxy for as long as anyone could remember. He had been hurt. Not by another Voranth, not by some overwhelming force he could point to and explain away as an exception. By a single, precise, unhurried decision made by someone the size of one of his own forearms. The official record of the trial spread through diplomatic channels within a day, and through informal channels, the kind that move faster than any embassy ever manages, within hours. I watched over the following weeks as the tone of every conversation involving humans on Corvus Reach shifted, slowly at first and then all at once, the way ice shifts on a lake before it finally, entirely, gives way. Voranth traders who had once walked the promenade with the loose, unhurried swagger of people who owned the space around them, began walking through Enclave 7 with a new and visible carefulness, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, the particular caution you extend to something you no longer fully understand. Baransk, Karagath's second, sought out Commander Doran privately within the week and asked, through him, whether the human woman would be willing to speak with him. Mira agreed, and I was present for that conversation as well, mostly out of professional habit by then, though I suspect also because I did not want to miss whatever came next. Baransk did not apologize, exactly. Voranth culture, I had learned, did not have an easy framework for that kind of exchange. Instead, he asked her, plainly and without the contempt his species usually reserved for such questions, how she had known where to strike. "I didn't guess," Mira said. "I studied. 2 nights of scans, medical records your own people shared decades ago, without ever imagining anyone would use them this way. I found the one place that had to be open, because your body needed it open to move at all, and then I waited for your friend to open it for me himself. He did that, not me." Baransk sat with that answer for a long moment. "We have always believed," he said finally, "that strength was the only thing worth measuring. We did not think to measure patience. Most people don't," Mira said, "until they meet someone who's had to survive on it their whole life." I thought, listening to that exchange, of Ashen's Reach, of ridgehounds that waited days before attacking, of a father handing his 12-year-old daughter a rifle, not as a rite of passage but as a chore, of a whole world that had taught its people, generation after generation, that patience and precision mattered more than raw force, because raw force alone had never once been enough to survive there. I filed my final report on the incident 3 weeks later, and I remember sitting with the draft for a long time before submitting it, uncertain how to summarize, in the careful, measured language my superiors expected, something that had genuinely reshaped my understanding of an entire species. I settled, eventually, on a simple observation, one I still believe holds true. Humanity's death worlds had not produced a species that valued strength above all else. They had produced a species that valued certainty, the specific, hard-earned certainty that comes from growing up somewhere that never once forgave a wasted effort, and that certainty, it turned out, was worth more in a fight than any amount of natural armor. News of the trial reached far beyond Corvus Reach in the following months, carried by traders and diplomats to a dozen other stations and a handful of homeworlds I had never personally visited. I heard, secondhand, that the story grew in the telling the way stories always do, gaining details that had never actually happened, losing others that had. But the core of it stayed remarkably consistent no matter how far it traveled, and I think that consistency is its own kind of proof that the truth of it mattered more than any embellishment could add. Species that had previously treated human diplomatic missions with the same polite, distant condescension, usually reserved for younger, less capable neighbors, began, quietly and without any formal announcement, to extend a slightly different kind of courtesy. Nobody said the word Deathworld with contempt anymore, not where I could hear it. It became instead a word people said carefully, the way you might mention a storm that had passed through recently and could plausibly return. I asked Mira, some weeks later, whether she had expected any of that, the ripple that spread so far beyond one cargo bay on one station. She was mending another piece of equipment when I asked, unsurprised by the question, the way she seemed unsurprised by most things by then. I wasn't thinking about any of that, she said. I was thinking about Owen, and his table, and how tired I was of watching someone decide who mattered and who didn't, just because nobody had ever proven him wrong before. And now they have, I said. Now they have, she agreed. That's all it ever needed to be. Not a message to the galaxy. Just one person, refusing to let something keep happening because everyone assumed it always would. We sat together in the common room of Enclave 7 that evening, much the way we had sat together the very first time she agreed to have tea with me, months earlier, before I understood anything at all about what her calm actually meant. The station hummed quietly around us, the ordinary sounds of 1,000 lives continuing exactly as they had before. Cargo moving, children laughing somewhere down the corridor, the recycled air carrying the smell of food from a dozen worlds cooked badly and eaten gladly anyway. Can I ask you something? I said, and have you answer honestly, the way you always seem to. She nodded, not looking up from her work. Were you afraid? I asked, standing in that circle, waiting for him to give you the opening you needed. She considered the question the way she considered everything, seriously, without rushing toward an easy answer, just to make the conversation comfortable. Yes, she said finally, the whole time. But fear where I grew up isn't something you wait to pass before you act. It's something you carry with you while you do what needs doing. It doesn't get to make the decision, it just gets to come along for it. I told her that sounded like a difficult way to live, carrying fear the whole time rather than waiting for it to leave. It's the only honest way to live, she said. Anyone who tells you they weren't afraid is either lying or they've never actually faced anything worth being afraid of. The trick isn't getting rid of the fear, it's not letting it choose for you. I thought about my own people then, the Kythan, our careful cities and our careful treaties, built across 1,000 years specifically to avoid ever needing to feel that kind of fear at all. And I wondered, not for the first time since arriving on Corvus Reach, whether we had actually grown wiser in avoiding it, or simply softer, less able to meet the moments that could not be avoided, no matter how carefully a life was arranged. I never fully resolved that question, and I suspect I never will. But I know this much, with a certainty I did not have before I met her. A species does not become remarkable by never facing danger. It becomes remarkable by facing danger so often, and for so many generations, that it learns exactly what to do with the fear that danger brings, rather than letting that fear decide anything on its own. Karagath left Corvus Reach 2 months later, his ceremonial plating packed away, his companions notably quieter than they had been on arrival. I saw him once more before his departure, standing near the docking bay he had walked so confidently on his first day, and he saw me as well, and inclined his head slightly, a small, formal gesture I had not seen him offer to anyone else on the station. Tell her, he said, that I have fought representatives of 11 species, and I no longer count myself among those who believed strength alone decided anything. I told Mira exactly that, word for word, later that same day. She listened, nodded once, and went back to whatever small repair had occupied her hands before I arrived. That's a start, she said. I still think about that phrase, sometimes, sitting in my own quarters, writing reports that grow more careful with every incident I am asked to summarize. That's a start, not a victory claimed, not a lesson declared finished, simply an acknowledgement that something had shifted, and that the shifting itself was only the beginning of whatever came next. I do not know, even now, everything the galaxy will eventually learn about humanity, about the worlds that shaped them, about how many more Karagaths are out there, certain of their own invulnerability, waiting for a quiet, unremarkable person to prove them wrong. I know only what I witnessed myself, on a trade station most star charts barely bother to name, where a man once said, in front of a silent crowd, that nothing could hurt him. And a woman who had grown up learning exactly how to make one chance count, every single time it mattered, answered him, without raising her voice at all. I don't miss. She never did.